Dr. Annette Bosworth, aka Dr. Boz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Let's hope you're as excited by the end of this talk as you are at the beginning, because we're going to take on a heavy subject. We're going to talk about cholesterol and that ketogenic diet. I want you to start with a deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Do that one more time. As you pull that oxygen in, you're landing that oxygen on these little cells that are disc-shaped and circulating around your arteries. The pace at which you do that will determine how well your brain works, your heart works, and your longevity in many ways. When people are on the ketogenic diet, after that wave of improvement has happened and they're starting to forget about how terrible they felt before starting the ketogenic diet, that they ask the question, Doc, am I at risk for a heart attack? Is all this fat going to give me the risk or put me at the top of the list for the number one killer in our country, which is still heart disease? What they're really asking is, will the zit in my coronary artery pop in the next few months? Yes, when I look inside a coronary artery that's filled with cholesterol, it looks much like a zit, that gooey substance that on the hours before prom, a satisfaction of a teenager is to pop that and get rid of it. But that satisfaction is the opposite scene when that same gooey, fat-based material filled with inflammation pops into your blood vessels. Those red blood cells that we filled with oxygen a few minutes ago, if they touch fat, a reaction of a blood clot happens. And if that zit was in your coronary artery, that's a heart attack. That if you head to your doctor and say, Doc, tell me, am I at risk for a heart attack? The first thing your doctor should say is, if you smoke, stop smoking. Number one, most reversible risk factor for a heart attack is don't smoke cigarettes. Number two is actually make sure your blood pressure is normal. These two reversible, controlled problems are the leading risk factors for heart disease. But the third thing that your doctor will probably do if they're trying to figure out if you have a heart attack is they're going to order a cholesterol panel, otherwise known as a lipid panel. And this character came onto the scene in the 1950s when we took total cholesterol, some triglycerides, they measured HDL, and then they calculated how many of these bad boys, otherwise known as LDL cholesterol, nicknamed bad cholesterol because that's where the bullets hang out. These are the particles that are predictive of the heart attack. And for over 50 years, we've been trying to predict heart attacks, finding the bullets. That 1955 lab test gives you about a 30,000-foot view of whether or not there's a pimple inside that coronary artery. If you want to take that 30,000-foot view to, say, 15,000 feet, we're going to add another blood test that you'll learn a little bit about in this lecture called a C-reactive protein. A C-reactive protein helps me see if you go to squeeze that pimple, you know, the one right before prom, and it's not ripe, then your C-reactive protein is probably low. That even though you've got a mess of a problem on your face, the inflammation is low. But if you go to squeeze that pimple and that satisfaction happens right before prom, so your picture doesn't look as bad, well, then your C-reactive protein was probably high. And that inflammatory rate turns out to be one of the biggest predictors for whether or not you're making bullets or not. But the most important number is what I talked to you about last year. I came and we also focused on these red blood cells. what the red blood cells were dealing with in your circulation led to another lab called hemoglobin A1C. For those of you that were here, we took these strings of globin, we wound them together, we added some heme units, and then we dripped in some iron. And this is called hemoglobin. Those 4 parking spots suck in oxygen almost as if magnetic. And it delivers it to your body in the form of your red blood cells and the hemoglobin inside those red blood cells. That hemoglobin has an enemy, and the enemy was glucose, or blood sugar. And when the glucose gets anywhere near that iron-filled heme unit, a magnetic suction of it happens as well. But unlike oxygen, that glucose is stuck there for the lifetime of that red blood cell. So if it's a baby red blood cell just exiting the bone marrow, it's going to be there for about 120 days. And like gum stuck to your shoe, there is no oxygen that can park in that spot for the rest of the life of that blood cell. Now, instead of carrying 4 oxygen molecules, you're only carrying 3. This decreased oxygen carrying capacity is because of your average blood sugar. That hemoglobin A1C, otherwise known as your 3-month report card for diabetics, should be done in people that are not diabetic. If you take up 5 seats out of 100, we call that a hemoglobin A1C of 5%. And that equates to a blood sugar that averages 97%. If you increase that by 1 seat out of 100, so now you have a 6% hemoglobin A1C, your average blood sugar now is 126, and your risk of a heart attack is 100-fold higher from one to the next. If your C-reactive protein is up, your blood pressure isn't controlled, and you smoke cigarettes. So let's set that test aside and go back to the 1950s one that your doctor is going to do to try and predict your cholesterol and whether or not you're going to be one of these people with a bullet, an artery filled with bullets that's going to pop into your bloodstream and cause you the worst day that you've had since going on that ketogenic diet. So we've got your total cholesterol. We can measure that. We've got your triglycerides. We can measure that. And we actually have your healthy cholesterol, your HDL. And there's a string around each one of those healthy cholesterols that allows me to measure that. But what we can't do with that 1955 panel is measure LDL cholesterol. It is a calculation. It is a guess. And I'm going to show you how the math was flawed from the beginning, and that there is a cheap, but depending on your lab, from $3 to $30 test that's been around since 1955 as well, and is a far better predictor, especially if you're on the ketogenic diet, of whether or not you're going to have a heart attack. Let's just show you one more look into what we did in 1955. We were trying to predict these things, this total cholesterol, triglycerides. We took a needle, we put it in your vein, and we sucked out some blood. And we sucked in these spheres, these balls. Well, they're balls of fat filled with cholesterol and triglycerides, the primary basis to your zit. That cholesterol circulating around your system comes in different shapes and sizes, and it's in that puzzle that the bullets hide. Whether or not your doctor, but more importantly, you know whether you have bullets or you've got the safe ones. That's what we're going to learn today. Here's another picture of those spheres, just so you're not deceived by my pictures. They're not 2-dimensional, they are 3-dimensional. They are a sphere, and that blue stuff on the outside is the water-soluble part, because we got to put the fat, the zit part, inside so that it doesn't touch the blood. That's what causes a clot. That's what causes the reaction of a heart attack. That green thing around the outside, well, that's the tag for all of the cells to know, well, what you got in yours? What you got in yours? And the way these spheres talk to the cells is in that string around the outside, a protein called an apoprotein. So in 1955, we took these spheres, we put them in we pulverized them, we centrifuged them, blew apart the outsides, and we took all of those yellow-shaped ovals with a string, and that was the total cholesterol. And then we put all of the triglycerides in a part of that centrifuge, and that's how we found your triglycerides. And then we gathered some of the strings on the outside, and that's how we found the healthy cholesterol. Again, the formula is flawed, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about why it's flawed and what you should pay attention to. So here's a beautiful picture of what the different lipoproteins or different spheres look like on a pretty slide. You'll notice that there's one that's so big it can't fit on the slide. And then you've got these other ones that have a bunch of alphabet soup along the bottom. I don't want you to focus on VLDL versus IDL. I don't care that you remember that. The only thing I want you to notice is that each one of them ends with an L. And that L stands for lipoprotein. We shouldn't have the language that says, hey, what's your good cholesterol? What's your bad cholesterol? What we should be asking is, how many lipoproteins have you got in your circulation on your ketogenic diet? And how long have they been circulating in your blood? Let's take a little lesson on how we would figure that out, how we would use 21st century to find the ones that have turned purple, the ones that are bullet-like inside your system. So you'll notice the first one does not end in L. It's called a chylomicron, and it's the biggest ship of delivering this nutrients, the nutrients that has cholesterol and triglycerides in it. The size along the bottom ranges from over 500 nanometers up to 1,000 nanometers, these really big, buoyant molecules floating in your system. And if I had everybody in this room eat a stick of butter, and then in about 5 minutes I had your blood drawn, give it 15 in case you got a gut ache, you would find the yellow film on the top of your blood. You wouldn't need a microscope to see it. You can just see it. Because these bad boys, chylomicrons, would be floating on the top of your blood. These chylomicrons last between 10 and 60 minutes after you eat. So when you come into my blood test to check your cholesterol 12 hours after eating, I better not find any of these. They better be long gone. Healthy people, they're gone within about 30 minutes. Not so healthy, or maybe you ate the whole stick of butter, and they're going to last closer to 60 minutes. During that time, it does its primary job, which is to deliver the most nutrient-dense strings of fat to cells. Those triglycerides get dumped out while it goes from a very big size down to 50 nanometers. And this is really where our lipoprotein story starts. Healthy people get rid of this VLDL at the size of somewhere between 50 and 80 nanometers in the first 2 to 3 hours. By 6 hours, again, there should be none of them left in your blood. When you get your blood drawn for your cholesterol test, you should be 12 hours fasted. There should be none of these that I can measure, or at least a very few random ones at best. What does this do? It also donates out a bunch of triglycerides throughout the body because every cell needs this triglyceride in order to process energy. It also needs cholesterol, but your body has a backup mechanism in every cell with a nucleus that it knows how to make cholesterol if you don't deliver it correctly. So the triglycerides get out the front door first. By this time, we've taken that molecule and we call it an IDL. The size is a little different. And you'll notice we've got about equal parts of cholesterol and triglycerides. This IDL does the same thing as its predecessor. Over the next several hours, it circulates around looking for any cell that might need some triglycerides. A brain cell, a tongue cell, an eye cell. They need nutrients, and this will deliver. And this lands us at the final part of our journey, the big, bad LDL cholesterol. But the cholesterol that's in that LDL is the same cholesterol that started out in the mothership, the chylomicron. It's the same cholesterol that was in the VLDL and the IDL and now the LDL. It's no more bad in this molecule than it was in the previous versions that have been circulating around your blood now for about, 2 to 3 days if you're healthy. If you're not so healthy, this LDL cholesterol can hang out for up to a week before it gives up. So as we look at these different particles, there is a way to test this in 21st century medicine. It's not very common. It's called a nuclear magnetic resonance. And instead of sucking up those red blood cells and spinning them in a centrifuge, they suck up those red blood cells and they put it in a magnet. And that magnet helps us separate them out into different sizes. Our job now would be to figure out which one's the bullet and how many have you got. So let's start with what would that look like inside somebody on a ketogenic diet that's got a healthy liver. That VLDL, or the beginning of our lipoprotein story, is in this patient. And that liver is beautiful. It's pristine. It looks gorgeous. And it's very efficient at what it does. You'll notice the cell over to the side is a muscle cell, and it's kind of hungry. It would like some triglycerides. And your VLDL will enter the scene of its life cycle somewhere between 70 or 80 nanometers, and then it will do its job. It will donate some of those triglycerides to any cell that's hungry. As soon as that is done, the VLDL will shrink a little, and some of them, their life is over. They get upregulated back into the liver and they're done. They recycle. But several more continue to circulate and they shrink in size. And now we've changed the size down to about 45 to 35 millimeters as it continues to give away those triglycerides. We changed the name, not the molecule, we just changed the name, and we call it an IDL with about equal parts of triglycerides and cholesterol. That IDL then does what the previous things did, donates some triglycerides to that muscle cell that's very hungry, and here we have our big, bad LDL cholesterol. Is it bullet-shaped? Is it dangerous? We don't know yet. So the size of that LDL will start out at about 23 nanometers, and before long, you'll see it recycle back into the liver. If I was to look at these particles circulating in your blood, and I would look down an artery, let's say that the artery leads to the liver, as it does in this case. Inside that artery, you would notice that there is one unique thing that if you had special glasses on, you could see. And that's that fuzzy thing on the bottom that is actually lining the skin, the inside tunnel of that coronary artery, or that artery that's going to your liver. If you put your finger in there and you pushed on it, it would feel sponge-like. It's called a glycocalyx, and it's very important for protecting things for getting outside the circulation when they don't belong there. If your inflammation is high, that's low. But our patient has very little inflammation. Their C-reactive protein is less than 1, a very good number. And their insulation layer, their glycocalyx, is still very protective. So here come our lipoproteins down the stream of blood, landing in the liver, and the liver catches them with these little mitts called receptors, and it takes it right up into the liver as fast as they come along. There is a constant sweeping of the blood to put those resources back into the liver where they can do good with them. This goes on day and night, 24/7. And our healthy patient recycles them as fast as they make them. Before we head into our unhealthy patient, let's just do a quick trip through what that life cycle, this exact same molecule, comes out of the liver at about 70 to 80 nanometers. We call it a VLDL. You'll notice it's over the red part of that arrow. As soon as it gives away those triglycerides, it becomes green. It's now a healthy VLDL. We change the name of it, not the particle, just change the name, call it an IDL, and once again, the quicker it can give away those triglycerides, making that particle smaller, the healthier our patient. On the LDL, you'll notice that the color of red to green is flipped, because as soon as that LDL particle is identified in the size of those 20 to 25 nanometers, it should get recycled. It should get out of your blood, and it should get back up into the liver. But if it hangs out too long, it becomes purple, becomes oxidized. And there's our bullet. Let's show you how we make some bullets. So here's our beautiful liver. But in this case, we are going to bathe it in insulin. Insulin is around because of that one number I taught you about last year, high blood sugar. The blood sugar goes up, your body will make insulin and sweep that sugar out of the circulation, keeping your blood sugar nice and low. That's what healthy looks like. How much insulin does it take to keep your blood sugar controlled? Well, that kind of depends on how much you eat, how often you eat, and a little bit of genetics. In this patient, they eat plenty of small particles and lots of times per day, and their liver is filled with sugar. The glucose that's there is a great parking spot because it's easy to reverse. As soon as your blood sugar drops, your body will return that sugar to your circulation, and you can use it in your cells. But after all the parking spots for the single sugar is filled, it does a little magic trick, and it spins these sugars together. We call it glycogen. And now we can store a lot more sugar in your liver, and it's still reversible. If your blood sugar gets low, your body can quickly undo those strings of sugar, put the sugar back into circulation, and you can use it. But this too only has so many parking spots. After your body's filled with blood sugar and then filled with glycogen, your body says, we're going to take a trip to the other side. We're going to turn these strings of sugar into fat. And now the way out of your body is no longer sugar. The only way out of your body for this resource is to burn the triglyceride or turn it into a ketone. But there's only so many parking spots for this too. We now have 10,000 more units of energy stored in your liver than we did with the glycogen when the triglycerides fill your liver. And the next thing it starts to do is just make globs of fat, little bitty pockets of fat that we call a fatty liver. That fatty liver, if I took it to autopsy and I put it right next to the guy who drank himself to death, having cirrhosis of the liver, you couldn't tell the difference. Not even the pathologist who looks at it under the microscope. It looks exactly the same. So in this case, we're going to start our story of a lipoprotein. And once again, the size of that VLDL is around 70 nanometers, just like our healthy patient. But unlike our healthy patient, when he tries to donate the triglyceride, it takes him much longer to find a parking spot. Everybody seems to be filled with their resource. And so as he tries to recycle some of them back into the liver's kind of stingy too, says, keep it, we're full. And so now, in the wake of that first dumping of triglycerides, well, there's a whole bunch of VLDLs behind him. And as the VLDL circulates again, looking for little corners where it can stuff some triglycerides, the size of that particle eventually gets small enough that we call it an IDL. Again, that's where our cholesterol triglycerides are about the same inside there, and it's in the 40s. And your IDL circulates and circulates, trying to find a home for where it's going to put those triglycerides before we finally see that our bad cholesterol, our LDL cholesterol, is being made. Unfortunately, it keeps circulating. It doesn't go back up into the liver. It's now been in your circulation for 4 days. And it starts to look a little rancid. This is a little rusty, a little oxidized. And the size of that particle is now very small. You've got a bunch of them, and they're too small. When I put that needle in your arm and draw that blood up 12 hours after the last time you've eaten, I don't have a random VLDL. I have a bunch of them. I don't have a random IDL. I have a bunch of those too. And there is a crop of those LDLs everywhere. Many of them are bullet-shaped. When I look at that bullet, it is causing more damage than doing delivery of this really important nutrient. And if we go back to that tunnel we're looking down that we looked at in our healthy patient, the first thing you'll notice is that these receptors, those catcher's mitts that are there to upregulate, to sweep the lipoproteins out of circulation, well, this patient doesn't have as many. They're gone. Why? Well, they were bored. They had nothing to do. That job of that receptor was to pull resources into the liver when the liver cell was hungry. But it's not hungry. It's been sitting there filled with resources trying to get out. And the number of receptors that pull resources into the liver has diminished. So that not only do you have a handful of these particles trying to upregulate, you have crops of them. You have a crowd of them. And they're all trying to get in, and there's only one door that's open. So as these particles take up home. They take up residence in your blood system, and they're circulating for days on end. The other part of the equation that's happened to this patient is that insulin did one more naughty thing. Insulin caused the inflammation for your lining, your protective glycocalyx. Well, it's gone. Your C-reactive protein, that thing that measures how ripe is your pimple, well, it's well above 3. And it has melted away your protective barrier that keeps these particles out of the wall of your artery. The other part is that the cells don't fit together so well. So these little turkeys find their way outside the circulation and inside the wall of your coronary artery. The first response is your body says, "Hell no, get out of here. You do not belong here. This is not your home. Go away." And your immune system rushes in to try and emulsify and, well, gobble up these particles that do not belong in the wall of your artery. That's the first of a fatty streak. If you only have a few particles, no problem. But if those particles keep coming day after day, month after month, year after year, that's how you form a zit inside the coronary artery, which takes between 15 and 20 years before it pops. And there are lots of years where we could have reversed that had we understood, was it the bullets you were making or was it normal cholesterol you were making? So let's go back to 1955 and tell you how the math is wrong on the way we've been measuring cholesterol for the last 50 plus years. So here's those VLDLs. It's our healthy patient, so it gives away some triglycerides. Others get upregulated into the liver, and it makes a crop of IDLs. Again, it gives away some triglycerides. Some get upregulated into the liver, and it makes a bunch of LDLs. This is where the bullets come from. But in this patient, as soon as that LDL is made, most of them recycle back into the liver. And 12 hours after you last ate, when I put that needle in your arm, I'm going to draw your blood. I'm going to take these particles and pulverize them. And I'm going to measure triglycerides. Those triglycerides are going to come mostly from the LDL particles, those smallest ones. And the tags that are around the outside of that LDL, I could measure those too. That test has been around since 1955, but most doctors don't do it. I'm going to take the one or two IDLs that I can find, pulverize that. There'll be a few triglycerides that are added to my score, and maybe one or two particles that'll come from. And finally, the VLDL will give us a big amount of triglycerides, but the number of particles is so small that it's really a nominal part of that equation. And this patient's triglycerides, they are beautiful. They're 65, and they are in the 2-digit range. That's bragging rights, very good. Their number of particles that were measured is also very low. Again, we like it in the 2-digit. Anything under 100 gets you a pretty good chance that you don't have any bullets around. And here's our patient with high insulin. Just like the other patient, we pulverize this, we pull out the triglycerides, and we measure them. And many of them come from the LDL particles. About half of them, about a third of those triglycerides, though, come from the IDL. And over half of the triglycerides are coming from the redundant VLDL particles that have been hanging around way too long in your system trying to find a parking spot. Their triglycerides is far above the two-digit mark. It's into the 2, 3. I've seen them at, 3,000. The number of particles it took to get that level is also a critical part of this equation. So here was the math. The total cholesterol minus the number of healthy particles is how we calculated the LDL particles. That's 1955's approach to this equation. Unfortunately, the math is wrong. Why is the math wrong? Because as we try to find which of these particles did we get the triglycerides from, which of these particles did we get the cholesterol from, we take them and without measuring their size, their density, we're going to pulverize and pull all the total cholesterol over under the total cholesterol. Report that out. We're going to put all the triglycerides in a bucket and call that your triglycerides. And rarely will the doctor measure the ApoB, the tag that told us how many particles did we start with. This protein, this ApoB protein, is a cheap test between $3 and $30, depending on your lab, but relatively cheap and been around for years. That in the spectrum of being able to decide, are you a bullet maker or not, it really does depend on if there are any VLDLs in your circulation at 12 hours, they better be in the green zone. If there are any IDLs at 12 hours, they better be in the green zone. And all of your LDLs had better be in the fluffy stage, in the mid-20s, not in the teen number for predicting the size of your LDL particles. So if you come to me and you say, Doc, I'm on this ketogenic diet, I feel great, my Crohn's disease is improved, my thyroid's working again, but I want to know, am I going to have a heart attack? Well, if you smoke, I'm going to tell you to stop smoking. If your blood pressure's high, we're going to work on that. The next test we're going to do is we're going to take your red blood cells, and even if you have to test it at home, I need you to know what your hemoglobin A1C is. What is your average blood sugar? This matters most. The next thing we're going to help you with is, how good is your slime layer? How spongy is that protective lining that lines the tunnels of your arteries? And if your C-reactive protein is less than 3, then I've got pretty good confidence that you have a nice glycocalyx preventing these turkeys from getting outside the tunnels of your coronary artery, the one where the pimple pops, and half the people's first symptom of a heart attack is death. If you've got the resources, this nuclear magnetic resonance test is possible. It's not terribly expensive, somewhere around $100, $75 to $125. But the second step of that is you got to make sure your doctor knows how to read that. Or you need to refer back to this lecture and say, are you in the green zone for these sections? The final thing that your doctor could be doing on every one of those patients is to measure the proteins around those spherical objects that get sucked into the test tube 12 hours after your last meal. That ApoB measures the number of total particles that are VLDL, IDL, or LDL. And that number alone, keeping it below 100, could save your life on a ketogenic diet. When people do keto, you can do it wrong. The first wave is easy. The ketones come, the appetite suppresses, the inflammation gets better, and your body is so thankful that you're eating better, they hardly remember how terrible it was after they've been doing it 3 or 4 months. But the sloppy version of keto stops looking for the number one killer of our communities today, which is still heart disease. This is not an easy topic to teach, but it is a very easy thing for you to follow, even if your doctor doesn't. Remember an ApoB, have your doctor test that, and if you have questions for me, I'll take a few of them right now, or I'll be out at the Keto Mojo stand answering questions. So there's 3 minutes left on the clock, which I think is impressive, actually. I can't see if anybody's... Oh, is that where the mic is? Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Hey, Dr. Boz, it's Blake from your Tampa Keto
Oh,
meetup.
yay! Nice to see you.
Likewise. Hey, so I was curious your take on digestive enzymes for fat and for protein. I've had a little bit of issues with digesting, doing the intermittent fasting and, getting everything digested properly with some gut health, quite extensive history. So I've had some issues kind of back and forth with, both ends of the spectrum as far as constipation, diarrhea, and making sure everything's digested properly.
Yes, well, thank you for the question, Blake. If I recall correctly, you have type 1 diabetes, right?
2.
Type 2? It's okay, his microphone's not working. So the enzymes that are responsible for breaking down fat, for emulsifying fat, are a critical part of the absorption. You're right. There are a few places where you don't need as robust of those enzymes, and they turn into those short and medium chain fats. You can't usually find those naturally in society unless you're being breastfed. But outside of that, they are mixed in with a lot of the longer chain fats. So when people try to eat foods that are medium chain fats, they end up with quite a mosaic of both long and medium chain, at which point you need these pancreatic enzymes. You need them in order to get them absorbed. And if your body can't keep up, especially if they have recently added it or they didn't eat at all for 48 hours, you can see some people's pancreatic enzymes not match their consumption, and they really do struggle with that diarrhea and on the other end, actually constipation. The antidote for that is test one is make sure you make pancreatic enzymes. Those are tests that your doctor can study your stool. If you don't make them, you actually need a prescription. That process of pancreatic enzymes and how to break that down can be, you can't fake your way through that. You can't fast your way through that. Some people it comes back, some people it doesn't. So the first step that I do when people struggle with this enzymatic match of their fats is really try to have the medium chain triglycerides, a steady delivery in your diet. Even if you have to supplement them for the next 3 weeks, that steady delivery is the best way to test how well is the absorption and how well are you tolerating it with the symptoms that you're struggling with. But the other part is I tell them not to fast. I tell them to keep that eating window at a very small level daily because the constant stimulation of the pancreas is the best place to begin. And that, in and of itself, is usually how this eventually reverses because the production matches the diet after about 4 to 5 weeks. That's where I'd start.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Boz.
You bet. We got 11 seconds left, so.
Hi, Dr. Boz.
One more question?
Yeah. Hi.
Yes.
My name
great.
is Cheryl. I'm a super fan. Thanks for coming. My question is about magnesium floats.
Yes.
I know you're a super big fan of those. I just can't wrap my head around that whole concept of how super concentrated aqueous solution of magnesium could soak through the stratus corneum of the skin when the skin is meant to keep things out. So I'm just wondering, do you know of any research that supports that, or is that just you echoing the advertisements of
No. The first time I heard this, I'm like, there's no way.
Yeah.
There is no way the magnesium ends up in their circulation. This can't be. And then you hear patients tell you, okay, doc, I don't care what you say. I feel great afterwards. I'm like, great. You meditated, you slept, you turned off the noise, you turned your screen off. I don't care what it is. Placebo works. Carry on. But enough times where I said, all right, let's go see if there's any stinking studies for this. And there was one study, and it was done pre and post to the magnesium float.
Small.
Yes, it was small, but they were able to measure the rise. They kept the pipette of the magnesium in while they were in the float, and they could see the rise in magnesium during the float. So it's small, but it was after that, on top of the just overwhelming positive feedback that I would get from patients, that, by golly, it really did penetrate in. And according to that study, you had a rise in serum magnesium, which is always transient. That's the hard part about magnesium. I mean, it's why the only study that you should be looking at is they have to measure during the time. I mean, even if you come in and you're in preeclampsia and we put a magnesium IV in you, and then you go home and you come back to the clinic 48 hours later, your magnesium is going to be normal in the blood within hours of the drip being off. So it's a very difficult thing to measure. You have to measure it in the serum at the time that it's being delivered. And that's a small study, but that's what I use to say, okay, I give. It does seem to absorb.
I just wondered if it was mostly placebo effect.
You're wondering placebo?
Yeah, placebo effect. Or I'm just wondering if all that magnesium comes rushing into your body, what happens to the other positive ions at the same time? Are they rushing out? Are the things being displaced? I don't know.
I think there's there's such a universal depletion of magnesium in so many people that you'll
just
see it.
Can't get too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can put an IV drip in a woman for 3 days to stop her contractions, and she's just fine.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. That's our app. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you out at Keto Mojo.